Greetings and welcome back, ladies, as we are winding down onto the end of this term, our first and hopefully last term online. We have just 2 more weeks to go. I don't know about you all, but I'm tired. But as we've had our 2 previous weeks have been a bit intense in terms of the homework, and I just want to say how incredibly just overwhelmingly happy and proud I am of the submissions and the effort that you guys have been putting in. I just love seeing your ideas come out into something tangible. I just love seeing everybody flex their creative muscles. And so the costume designs and the set designs have just been so spectacular and awesome and just heartwarming. I don't think you'll understand how much it means to me when you get to do things like that. Um, so yeah, just keeping that momentum for the last 3 weeks as we go along. But this week your homework is gonna be a bit lighter. But the class is a little bit heavier in terms of what we're actually going to learn. So what we're gonna do is just look at a general context, just checking in on the kind of world that the Master of Carnival was is based in, based on what we know from the history. So even like a really important thing that we're gonna talk about today as well is um tying in this history of Carnival to what is going on now in the world, with the riots and uprisings and things. Um, it really is very similar in terms of how Carnival came about, as well as how um, things are now, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement and all these protests going on. Anyway, so as dramaturgs, as we have been for the entire term and will continue to be, very important. The key part of your job is just understanding the world that they play the story world basically, and that is what we are going to be looking at today with a really interesting introduction to the history of Carnival, bouncing off of what we did last term in terms of the traditional Carnival characters, and a nice, fun, simple, easy, light homework at the end of it. So we're just gonna start off watching two videos of how Carnival was in the 1950s, which is when the Master of Carnival is set, just to give a little context, just to give a little idea, a little visual, so you understand what exactly what we're talking about. And then we're going into the history. So here we go.
This, then, is Trinidad. But captivating though it is in its own right, for 2 days in the year, this serenity is transformed into a vivid blaze of color by the annual Carnival, which, although not an official holiday, plays such a great part in the lives of the people that the rest of the year is spent preparing for it. The people enter wholeheartedly into the spirit of the carnival, and the preparation is taken most seriously. Great secrecy being maintained, for example, over the wonderful costumes to be worn. The money for this, collected from individuals and paid into a common fund, sometimes represents several months' hard-earned wages. By the way, the marches and calypso accompaniment to the procession are provided by the rhythm of the now famous steel bands, specially made for the occasion. About 50,000 people, divided into sections known as bands, each with its own picturesque name like Brazilian Bandits and Crazy Man Crazy, take part. The bands vary in size from 1,500 people to ingenious individuals like Betty Lou and Margaret, although of course they haven't had time to prepare proper costumes. As you can imagine, the cost is fabulous. The material used in the Glory of Greece band with 611 people alone included 700 sheets of aluminium for the armor, 3,000 yards of velvet, and 600 yards of satin. Prizes are awarded for the most original and attractive outfits, Incidentally, even the most tremendous contraptions worn on the head are still called hats. But the expenses and effort that go into these fantasies are far more than the prize value. Another astonishing thing is that no matter what the cost, costumes and figures are not used again. It is, in fact, a year's work for 2 days. Every type of subject and theme, both real and imaginary, is depicted by the bands, each rivaling the next in originality, ingenuity, and color spectacle. While just as color conscious, the crowd dress as vividly as they can.
Right, diving straight into the history of Carnival. So, and as you can see, a lot of the aspects from the videos you see, you could quite easily picture them mapping onto the play that we're doing as well. Let's get into it. So, Carnival is a season that spans from the beginning of the year until Carnival Tuesday, which is Carnival Monday and Tuesday are the 2 days right before Ash Wednesday. So Carnival itself is a season, but Mass is a climax of Carnival. And we learned last term when we were doing traditional Carnival that Mass is short for masquerade. That's with one S, not the two S's um like church mass. So it all started when we were, I think, either Spanish or British colony, and they invited French aristocrats. Aristocrat just being a fancy word for rich people. So they invited French people from other islands, um, including St. Lucia, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and also from France. They just basically said, you know what, Trinidad is lit, you all should come live here. And the French people were like, okay, you're gonna give us land, you're gonna give us a little incentive to come. And they came and they basically started living here, and they brought their own culture, their own traditions that kind of changed up the way that Trinidad is. So you see, we have people with French last names like Lejean, um, Batiste, and all the other French last names that just aren't coming to my mind right now, and French place names like Sanssouci, like Avocat, and all the other ones that not coming to my mind right now. So yeah, so the French people, two things that they brought um, was this practice of having these parties, these big parties right before Lent, because obviously Lent is a time of fasting. So what they would do, which is what Mardi Gras is, Fat Tuesday, they would just go all out the days right before Lent. So they'd have all the meat, they'd party like mad, they'd drink and do all kind of madness because they know for the next 40 days they're gonna be tied down and sober and quiet. Um, so they would do that, and they also had masquerade balls. So basically, a big fancy party where they would dress up. Either they would dress up or they would dress down. So they would dress down as slaves, or they would dress up in like fancy gowns with masks and dresses and stuff like that. And so this was during the time of slavery, and the enslaved Africans were not allowed to attend these masquerades. So what they would do is that they would look on, they would say, okay, all right, okay, that's what's going on there. And they'd have their own. They'd have it in their own living quarters. They use their own costumes, their own materials, their own live music, which would have been African drumming. And they made it their own. They did their own thing that was parallel to the upper class white masquerade balls. So as I said, during slavery, they used to do it in their own living quarters, kind of not necessarily hiding, but not in the public eye. And then when they abolished slavery in 1838, they took to the streets with a huge celebration of freedom. And that was in itself a masquerade, a carnival. Um, so yeah, so emancipation was the first time that carnival was taken to the streets. And from then on, they continued with what developed into canboulay, which comes from the French word can brûler, meaning cane burning. And what that was where the slaves would reenact the times. Well, these are now the ex-slaves, ex-enslaved, will reenact the times during slavery when the cane would burn. And of course, cane being the main crop because sugar was our export product. So when the cane fields were set on fire, so it's either that somebody was doing vandalism and set the fields on fire, or they just caught a bushfire. So they would have to work really hard to harvest all the cane before it burned down. But what would happen is that also because they're just working for the entire night trying to get the cane harvested, they would also have singing and dancing and lighting flambeaux, and it would just be a real celebratory, an active, lively atmosphere. So they reenacted that now in Canboulay, and that was what you would call, I guess, the early carnival for Black people in Trinidad. So yeah, as I said, Canboulay was their way of reenacting those times during slavery. Um, So they used to sing, they used to dance, they used just think about carnival. It was basically a carnival. But also, after slavery, they deliberately used it as a way to basically upset the upper class people who would have been white people. So these were the people who had enslaved them for hundreds of years. So obviously they were upset and they had negative sentiments towards them. So basically, instead of throwing sticks and stones at them, they used to use these celebrations to deliberately try and upset them, to antagonize them. Um, right. So, of course, after slavery was abolished, the ex-enslaved now had to move out from the plantations and move somewhere else. So they moved into barrack yards, which were basically very unpleasant dwellings where, like shanty towns, meaning makeshift housing where everybody lived super close together in a very confined space with like no outdoor plumbing, um, not properly built, that kind of thing. So they moved into the city, on the outskirts of the city now. And of course, it was a lot of them cramped into these very small spaces because it was a huge amount of people who now had no more work on the plantation and had to go to the cities to find other things to do with their yard, with their life. So these were barrack yards, and in these yards, because they were so close together and because they all came from the same situation of being enslaved, they had the same kind of negative feeling towards the people who had tortured them for so long, and who had tried to rob them of their identity and all these things during slavery. So these spaces now, where you just had a whole lot of people from the same background confined into these very, very small and intimate spaces, was where you had things like calypso, stick fighting, and Jamit mass originating. So you'd have remembered from your project last term that you might have heard about the Jamit era, in the development of many traditional carnival characters. So the word Jamit itself, nowadays we know Jamit to be just somebody who's, loud, misbehaving, that kind of thing. But the word Jamit originally comes from the French word diametre, which basically means, like, if you think about the word diameter, it's a line. So that French word is basically saying the line of acceptability, of civilness, of respectability. So it's basically saying that this is the line, and all of these people, these ex enslaved people, are below that line. And also in the cities, there was, well, in Port of Spain particularly, these barrack yards were located behind the bridge, as they call it, which is the bridge to the East Dry River. So they almost saw the bridge as like the line, and behind that, everything is just madness to them. And it's because in the main parts of the city in Port of Spain, that is where all the rich people lived, and behind the bridge, and that's talking about places like Laventille, Piccadilly. These are places where the lower class Africans lived. So they almost calling them behind the line, kind of, by saying Jamets. So in these barrackyards, the Jamets, as you call them, they created portrayals, and we know from studying last term that some of them would have mocked the upper class. So like the Dame Lorraine and the Sailor were satirical portrayals mocking the people at the time, or they depicted folklore characters, so like the Laja Bless and the Sukuyan, or they reflected on the traumas of slavery. So remember looking at the flambeau and the whips and things like that as symbolism for things about slavery. So each yard, each jamet, each barrack yard would compete against each other in these different portrayals. And that's often led to violence because people were very particular and very defensive about their, I guess you could say, their, their territory. And of course, because a lot of these portrayals were deliberately intended to ridicule and to mock and to irritate the upper classes, they really hated it. The white people at the time hated it and they wanted to get rid of it. So this is a picture of nowadays behind the bridge in Port of Spain. So that is literally the bridge, and you see steel pan and mass and stuff happening behind it. So that is where basically all, if not most, if not all of the traditional carnival portrayals were invented. So these are pictures of kind of Jamet mask. So you can see it's not pretty. It's this one in particular is called a pissenlit. So this portrayal is supposed to represent a slave who during slavery used to basically keep themselves dirty. So they would let their menstrual blood flow. They would soil themselves and eat from a posy. If you don't know what a posy is, it's basically where you a pan where you relieve yourself, you do your number ones and twos. So doing all of that so that the planter, the slave master, would not rape them. So that is the kind of mask that they would play. And of course, the upper class people at the time really did not like it. These pictures are from this year, from 2020. It's just a reenactment of these things. And of course, we know the devils representing the evils of slavery and things like that as well. So, all of those things had become part of Canboulay, and in 1881, you had the Canboulay riots, which was where, because all this time the authorities spent hating the carnival slash Canboulay practices, and then there was a time for carnival when the masqueraders and the police at the time ended up in a riot. And after this riot, then they put laws in place to ban drumming, stick fighting, masking, large crowds, all of these things. So basically, put in laws to clamp down on Canboulay. So in the meantime, because they weren't allowed to do their African drumming anymore, they instead came up with things like tambu bamboo, and then they banned tambu bamboo. So they started using oil drums, and then eventually that turned into steel pan. They used all kinds of different metal things that turned into rhythm sections. So all of these things were where there were rules, very strict rules put against them to try and silence them. And the creativity of the people just found ways to get around it and to innovate and to do new things so that they would be able to express their own cultural identity. So Carnival did continue under these laws, but it was much, much tamer than before. It wasn't as wild, you didn't have as much nudity, things like the jab malassi, stick fighting, and all these things. So, and this was because obviously they didn't want to get in trouble anymore. They just wanted to play their mass, and they didn't particularly want to be in trouble with the police. Um, so Carnival kind of took a little bit of a shift, and it focused more on like pretty costumes rather than the kind of, screaming and noise making and kind of wild celebrations that they had before. And at this time now that there were laws against it, because before, um, when after emancipation, when the black people took it over, the whites and the upper classes, the mulattoes, which is half black, half white, and the white people didn't really participate in carnival anymore because they felt it wasn't their space. They felt intimidated. So now that there were laws banning all the things that made them feel intimidated, they found their way back into carnival, and they changed it basically into what they wanted it to be. So instead of putting laws on it now, the government decided, okay, they're behaving themselves. So instead of putting laws to really come down hard on the masqueraders, they just put incentives. Like they had competitions where they obviously would be able to regulate what kinds of costumes, because everybody wanted to win some money. So they would put categories where people would make pretty costumes instead of dressing up like a blue devil or a Jabmalassi and screaming at people. Um, so yeah, so it all became just a bit prettier, a bit cleaner at this time. And then the upper classes just kind of molded carnival into what they wanted it to be. So while carnival before was community oriented, as we would have seen in the video, and as we see very much in the Master of Carnival, they turned it into something that they would be able to make money off of. And that is how we have that kind of pretty mass today, where people pay thousands of dollars for a mass produced costume rather than making it at home. And before this, before World War II, women didn't really participate in carnival very much, as you see in the Master of Carnival. Ursula, is Ursula a wife? The wife. She stayed home and sewed, and she didn't participate. Yeah, you have people like Doris and stuff like that, but most of the masqueraders are male. And then after World War II, the Americans just kind of came and did what they wanted to do in Trinidad, and Trinidadians started doing what they wanted to do too. So women was like, yeah, man, we coming out there and we coming out half naked too. So right, now that we have a bit of an idea how Carnival came about, we're just gonna go briefly into understanding how it was at the particular time that the play itself is set in, which is in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, white people and mulattoes had their own bands. So mulatto meaning half black and half white, and then most of them were transported on trucks. So they didn't actually walk through the city, but they would dress up in their costumes and sit down in the tray of a truck, and a truck will drive them around, like if they in a motorcade, like if they're the queen. Um, and actually walking through Port of Spain, walking to play mass was considered a black people thing, actually. While East Indian and Chinese people didn't take part as much, they rarely did in the 1950s, except for the jab jab, which we learned they used to call coolie mass, and the dragon, which came about eventually as well, due to the Chinese influence. And then also, the themes for bands, which is a little bit different from it is nowadays, were inspired by the history or from biblical stories, from Hollywood movies and literature, or from travel. So it would be fantasy themes of different countries and things like that. So we see how the government's plan really worked. They wanted Carnival to be more pretty, more calm, less intimidating, more and more in line with what they wanted it to be. So these were the kinds of portrayals that would win Band of the Year. So this doesn't mean that people didn't continue to do their Blue Devil and their Jab Jab and thing, but they didn't get as much recognition for it, or they wouldn't get money for it as much as these pretty, just really calm kinds of costumes. And all of these things, you see it's coming out in the Master of Carnival, because Del Pino's band is King Belshazzar, which is a historical slash biblical story. And actually, Basilon, or Basilon, who is the guy who he's competing against, that was an actual masked man at that time. And I didn't know that until I was doing research for this PowerPoint self. So yeah, all of these things, you can see it being reflected in the Massive Carnival, the community-oriented spirit of it, the historical themes, the lower class, the African participation, the male centered participation, all of that you can see in the play itself. Right, so your homework, nice and light and easy this week. You're going to get a playlist for me of 5 songs that would have been played at Carnival in the 1950s. And of course, you're going to say who sang them. Hint, hint, easy way to do this. Look at the road march winners from that point in time. And also, I want you to find 5 mask designers who would have operated at the time that the Master of Carnival is set. So do some Googling, do some looking up, and just, yeah, just to wrap up, just thinking about, the fact that if people had not protested, if people had not opposed, if people had not put their foot down, if they hadn't innovated, and if there weren't riots and uprisings, we would never have Carnival, we would never have steel pan, we would never have mass, we would never have these cultural art forms that we have today, of people just really persisting and saying, this is my culture, I am going to do what I want with it. So, yeah, all of that just to think about, that uprising and opposition is a very important part of who we are as Trinidadians and how our culture has been formed, and it is something to be very proud of. Yeah, that's it for today. As usual, if you have any questions, queries, comments, concerns, you know where to find me. And just keep it up. Keep up the momentum. Great job, guys. We're doing a really, really great job. And we're going to continue doing it over